Hello and welcome back to Learn the Bible in a Year for March 6th, 2026. Today is National Oreo Day. I actually have a fun little story here about Oreos. When my oldest son, Owen, was born, he was by far, and this is definitely certifiable, the worst baby sleeper in the history of our planet. So he would wake up 3 to 4 times a night, and he would stay up and not go back to sleep for an hour to an hour and a half. And he did this until he was 2 years old. So terrible, terrible sleeping baby, literally the worst. So when my wife and I would get up at night to take care of the baby, it was quite torturous for a long time. Now, here's where Oreos come in. When I would get up in the middle of the night for the third or fourth or fifth time to take care of my son, I would always treat myself to an Oreo cookie. And in a small way, I believe that Oreo cookies are a big part on why I never threw my son Owen out a window during those dark days. So, in that way, thank you, Oreo cookie. I appreciate you. Today, we're going to walk through an incredibly symbolic ritual. Then we're diving headfirst into one of Jesus' most intense and debated sermons, the Olivet Discourse, where he talks about the end of the world. And we'll finish with the triumphant conclusion to Psalms 30. So let's jump right in. Now, yesterday we read the diagnostic manual for the Zerath, or infectious skin disease. Today in Leviticus 14, we get the ceremony for what happens when someone is healed. And it's one of the most vivid symbolic rituals in the entire Old Testament. It's a two-part process. First, the priest goes outside the camp to confirm the person is healed. Then he orders a bizarre set of items: 2 live, clean birds, a piece of cedar wood, some scarlet yarn, and a hyssop branch. And here's what happens. One bird is killed in a clay pot over fresh, living water. Then the live bird, the cedar, the yarn, and the hyssop are all dipped into the bloody water. The priest sprinkles the healed person 7 times, declares them clean, and then releases the live bird to fly away. A question you might have when reading through this portion of scripture is, what the heck is going on here? This is weird and odd, and why is God asking the Israelites to do this? This seems, well, strange to say the least. This is actually a beautiful picture. We need to remember that the entire Bible, actually all of the history of humanity, all points to one event. The entire Old Testament points towards the coming of Jesus. The Gospels point towards Jesus. It's the life of Jesus. And then the rest of the New Testament points back to Jesus. So certainly when these acts were taking place, when these priests were, performing these rituals, certainly these priests would not have understood why they actually had to do these things. It's not until thousands of years later that we see that these particular acts are pointing towards Jesus. Jesus would be the first bird in this example, the one that gives his life so that the other one can be free. Right? In the same way, Jesus gave his life for us living today so that we can be in good standing with God. He made atonement for us. So all of these symbolic acts all point towards Jesus, the Messiah. But as I said before, this is a two-part act, and it's not over, just part 1 is over. The person can now enter the camp, but has to wait for 7 more days. On the 8th day, part 2 begins. They bring a series of offerings: a guilt offering, a sin offering, a burnt offering, and the priest takes some of the blood from the guilt offering and dabs it on the person's right earlobe, right thumb, and right big toe. He does the exact same thing with oil. This is the exact same ceremony used to ordain a priest. God isn't just making the person clean here. He is reconsecrating them, recommissioning their ears to hear his word, their hands to do his work, and their feet to walk in his ways. Then the chapter ends with a very similar process for dealing with mold that you might find in your house. It gets inspected, quarantined, and if the mold persists, the house is torn down. This is once again an example of a religious practice that God had the Israelites do that did symbolically point towards Jesus, but also had some practical aspects here because mold isn't something good to keep in your house, as we all know. Now we jump into Mark 13. Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple, and one of them, probably a country boy from Galilee, was just awestruck by the size of the buildings. He says, "Teacher, look at these magnificent stones." Jesus' reply is kind of a bombshell. He says, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." This was pretty unthinkable to hear. The temple was the center of the Israelite universe. Now, later on the Mount of Olives, the inner circle, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, ask him privately, "When will all these things happen and what will be a sign?" What follows is what's called the Olivet Discourse. It's a dense and difficult and debated prophecy. Jesus seems to be weaving together two future events: the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happens after his lifetime in AD 70, his own final second coming at the end of history. So, those two events, and he kind of weaves those two events all together in this particular prophecy. Now, if you want to know more information and do a real deep dive on the Olivet Discourse, I do an entire deep dive episode on Mark chapter 13. You can find that episode on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening to this episode right now. You can just search Mark 13 and you will find more of a deep dive on this portion of Scripture. But here are some of the cliff notes. He gives them signs. He warns them not to be alarmed. There will be false messiahs, wars, earthquakes, famines. He calls these the beginning of the birth pains. He warns them about intense persecution, but then he gives a specific actionable sign for the first event. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is a reference to the prophet Daniel, and historically, Christians have seen its fulfillment when the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem. The early church, remembering Jesus' words, fled the city before it was destroyed and were saved. But then Jesus pivots. He talks about cosmic upheaval. The sun darkens, the moon falling, the stars falling, and then at that time they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. This part of the prophecy is certainly talking about his final return. Then it gives us a parable about a fig tree. When you see the leaves, you know summer is near. In the same way, when you see these signs, you will know he, meaning himself, is at the door. And then he says one of the most debated lines in the Bible. He says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened." If you're curious about this jarring statement, I talk about this statement a lot in my episode that goes over Mark chapter 13, so check that out. And we finish up today with the latter half of Psalms chapter 30, and it goes like this: "To you, O Lord, I called, and I begged my Lord for mercy. What gain is there in my bloodshed, in my descent to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it proclaim your faithfulness? Hear me, O Lord, and have mercy. O Lord, be my helper. You turned my mourning into dancing. You peeled off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, that my heart may sing your praises and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks forever." Alrighty, this episode has been brought to you today by a Christian company called Covenant Security Equipment. They sell bullet-resistant windows and secure transaction systems and drive-through installations, a bunch of different things that help with security. They have security equipment for commercial buildings as well as home residential buildings, the one you might live in right now. If this is interesting to you, go to covenantsecurityequipment.com to find out more. And also, don't forget to pick up a copy of the Learn the Bible in a Year workbook. This is the workbook that I wrote for you as you go through reading the Bible in a year. It acts kind of like a journal, and it comes with additional questions and fun facts about our daily readings. The link to the digital version and the paperback version are in the show notes, so go check that out. All right, what was your main takeaway from today's reading? My main takeaway is what we read in Leviticus 14 today. There's these sacrificial ceremonies that were performed when people were cleaned of their skin diseases. It's just a good reminder to me that all of these religious activities, all of the religious activities outlined in the Old Testament, all points to Jesus. So when we have that in our mind, it's actually very easy to see Jesus in all of these religious practices. The one dove giving its life for the other is a great reminder of Jesus' sacrifice for us. So that was my main takeaway from today. What was your main takeaway? I'd love to hear your comments there in the comment section, wherever it is you are listening to this podcast. All right. Well, that is the episode for today, and I will see all of you cool cats again here tomorrow.